We will go more and more into the various finance models that are actually applicable. This case study is a very basic finance plan for you to kind of slowly dive into the subject matter and understand what it entails. So a few things that are actually happening, like bank interest and premium payments and all that stuff that we'll learn about when we go further into the course, they will not apply here. This is just a basic finance plan for you to get your feet wet, to understand how the basic structure works. So I will walk you through this step by step, and this is for case study 3 taken in London, so you understand how the finance elements come together, how they play together, how they are applied in a way that that there will be some profit, that there will be some net revenues in this case. So take a look, and if you have any questions about this finance plan, feel free to email me. We have established our movie taken in London has a budget of $10 million. That's the production cost for the movie. Our sales agent ran some estimates for it for international sales and established that 75% of the budget could likely be projected to be received out of distribution revenues from international sales, that is outside of the US. The sales agent then goes ahead and does some pre-sales, and in our case 35% of the budget were pre-sold. That's $3.5 million in actual pre-sale contracts. So while the international sales estimates are just estimates, projections, the pre-sales are now actual contracts. These are actual distribution agreements, and they're called pre-sales only because they're done before we're producing the movie. Now, once we've done our pre-sales, we have to figure out how many rights do we still have available. That's very simple. We're going to take our international sales estimates. We're deducting our pre-sales. That's $7,500,000 minus $3.5 million, and we're left with $4 million. So $4 million worth of rights is what we still have available for us to sell. So let's keep that in mind, because it's going to play a role in a little bit when we're talking about the bank loan. We will guess that our US distribution rights revenues are worth about 20% of our budget. That's a guess at this point. And what will happen later in our case study is that we're actually selling the movie to a US distributor, but we're not selling it like the pre-sales before we're producing the movie. We're selling the US actually after the movie is finished. We're screening it at the festival, and that's usually how that works. And why are these pre-sales important to us? Because in reality, they're nothing else but pieces of paper, right? They're just an agreement. So what do we actually do with these agreements? Because they're not actual cash, we can't use them to cover our production costs. So what we do with these distribution agreements is we're taking them to a bank. And the bank will look at these agreements and will give us a loan based on these actual distribution agreements. So that means that we take the distribution agreements to the bank, we get a loan from them, and then later when the distributor is actually paying, because they don't pay until we deliver the movie, that payment then goes to the bank to repay for this loan. So the bank knows this, which is why they're happy to give us a pre-sale loan based on the contracts, on the distribution contracts we have achieved. So in this case, the bank will give us a pre-sale loan of $3.5 million. The bank will do something else. The bank will also give us what's called a gap loan. And a gap loan is a loan against unsold rights. Remember earlier when I said we still have $4 million worth of rights that we could sell? Because from our sales estimates, which were $7.5 million, we've only actually sold $3.5 million worth of distribution agreements. That means right now we still have $4 million left to sell. The bank will look at these $4 million and will say, you know what? 50% of that I will give you a loan against. And that's called a gap loan. So in addition to our pre-sale loan of $3.5 million, the bank will also give us a gap loan based on the unsold rights of $2 million. So now we received a bank loan of $5.5 million. Now we have to cover a budget of $10 million. So far, we have received $5.5 million from the bank for a pre-sale loan against our distribution agreements and a gap loan against the unsold rights that we can still sell. In this little chapter here, we're going to look at production incentives. Now, production incentives are incentivized regions giving producers and productions money for spending money in that region. So if you spend $10 million in Georgia and they have a 25% credit, you get $2.5 million back as a credit. Now that usually happens after you spend the money, after you went to Georgia, after you produced your movie. That doesn't really help us here because we're trying to use that money to cover our production costs. So how do we do that? Well, we are estimating what we will be spending in Georgia. We take the estimate to a production incentive lender who will then advance this amount to us. And we don't have to pay the incentive lender back because the incentive lender is paid by the state of Georgia. So for us, this is a non-recoupable finance element, so we don't have to pay this back. We do pay the incentive lender a hefty 15%, usually in fees, but we're not going to talk about that here. We're going to keep it simple. In our case, what we'll do, we'll take the production incentive, we add it to the finance sources. So now we get another $2 million and already have $7.5 million to cover our $10 million budget. So what else can we get? The last piece of the puzzle to cover our $10 million budget is the equity investment. We got $5.5 million from the bank. We got $2 million as an incentive that we don't have to pay back. Obviously, the bank loan we have to pay back, and we'll get into that later. So we're missing $2.5 million to hit our $10 million mark, and the equity investor who we spoke with is agreeing to give us 25% of the budget. In the ideal world, you don't ever want to put more than 35% in equity in a movie where you also have a gap loan. Now, let's assume you don't have a gap loan. Let's say the bank would only give us the pre-sales as a loan and no gap. If that's the case, you can actually go up to 50 to 55% for the equity because the equity investor can take over that gap position without the risk changing for him. And how that works we'll get into in a future model, but for now just know in this situation right now we have a $10 million budget. The $2.5 million from the equity investor come in and we're now fully financed. So let's summarize that finance plan that we have. Our budget is $10 million. The sales estimates for international distribution, these are projections, not actual sales, are estimated to be $7.5 million. We then secure pre-sales of a portion of this, 35% of the budget, and $3.5 million in pre-sales. This leaves us with unsold rights of $4 million because $7.5 million minus the pre-sales of $3.5 million leaves us with $4 million of unsold rights. We will be selling, we're hoping to sell the US for 20% of the budget. So we'll be hoping to get later after we produce the movie another $2 million. Now, these $2 million are not helping us right now at all to fund our movie because they're not available to us at this moment. They will play a very important part when we do our recoupment schedule, but for now, they don't do nothing for us because they frankly don't exist at the time you're putting this financing together. Now, the financing that we're putting together consists of a bank loan. The bank will give us the $3.5 million against the pre-sales that we have secured in contract. So these are actual pre-sale distribution agreements that the bank will be cash flowing for us. The bank will also give us a loan based on the $4 million that we still have to sell. That loan is 50% of the unsold rights, meaning 50% of $4 million is $2 million. So the bank will give us $2 million in a gap loan. Now remember that the bank gap loan is going to cap at 20% of your budget. If we, for example, would have had left $5 million in unsold rights, which could mean we would have had a collateral of $2.5 million, we still would only get $2 million because that's already 20% of our budget. So the bank will never give you more than 20% of the budget, no matter how much collateral you have available, how much unsold rights you have available. They will never give you more than 20%. So that's the maximum you can get. Of course, it goes down from there, but that's the maximum. So the total senior bank loan we will be receiving is $5.5 million. the production incentive that we're getting cash flowed by an incentive lender, so that we don't have to wait to do the movie in the incentive region and wait for the money to come in after we made the expense. So this incentive lender gives us an advance of what we will be getting later from the taxable region, and that is $2 million. So now with this advance, we can use this money to finance our $10 million budget. So that leaves 25% only for the equity investor with $2.5 million to finance. That gets us to a fully completed production budget of $10 million. Now we have produced the movie. We're now going to film festivals like the American Film Market or the Cannes Film Festival or Sundance. We go to all these various markets and we're selling our rights. After we've done that, we actually come to the conclusion that international distribution revenues are actually hitting the $7.5 million altogether that we are hoping to get. So this includes obviously the pre-sales, but altogether we're getting $7.5 million in revenues from international distribution. That is excluding the US. Now the US will also now be sold. We're going maybe to Sundance, and maybe a US buyer is picking up the movie after they screened it, and they're giving us $2 million. This is just for US rights. Now, altogether, international distribution revenues and US distribution revenues make up worldwide distribution revenues. In our case, the worldwide distribution revenues that we receive are $9.5 million. Now, how does that work with the fact that we already spent $10 million on the budget? Aren't we losing money here right now? Well, let's figure it out. Well, let's figure out if we're losing money by looking at all the people that we actually have to pay, because there are a few people that want to make money. There's a few loans we have to pay back. There's a few investments we have to pay back. So let's look at what this exactly entails. We have a collection agent, and the collection agent will charge us 1% for managing the collection account, and that work includes receiving all the revenues deriving from the sale of distribution rights, all the worldwide rights that are coming in, they're now being paid into the collection account that is managed by the collection agent. And then the collection agent also handles all the repayments, all the expenses, and all the costs that have to be paid to all the parties involved in this movie. So for this work, for the collection agent taking care of all the accounting in our movie, they're charging us 1% of whatever the amount is that hits the collection account. Remember earlier we said that we are making $9.5 million in revenues? Well, 1% of that is $95,000. That is what the collection agent is charging us. So next we have the sales agent. The sales agent is responsible for selling the distribution rights on our behalf, and they basically charge a fee for that. And the fee is charged on the distribution rights that they have sold. So in this case, again, we have $9.5 million in distribution rights that we have sold. 12% of that is $1,140,000. That's what we have to pay to the sales agent. The sales agent will also charge a distribution expense. In this case, they're charging us $95,000. Distribution expenses can be used for things like posters and trailers and some of these market expenses when they take the movie to Berlin or to Cannes or to Toronto or wherever they go. So that's what that money is used for. Next, we obviously have to pay the bank back. The bank gave us a loan of $5.5 million. This is the moment where we're paying them back. And then lastly, we have to pay the equity investor back. $2.5 million is what they gave us. So here is what we're paying them back. So now if you look at all these expenses, you notice that you're not paying back the $2 million that you received from the incentive lender. Remember? Well, that's because it's a non-recoupable finance source. You do not have to pay this back, which is great. So now you don't have to pay it back, and you're actually making profit of $170,000. That is your net revenues, and that's your profit on this movie.